In southern Scotland, in the parish church of the village of Ruthwell, stands a stone monument from the 8th century kingdom of Northumbria. Destroyed in the 17th century and reconstructed in the 19th, the Ruthwell cross is a relic from the vanished world of early medieval reading and writing. On the cross, as well as carved images, you can see inscriptions in two very different languages.
So what we have here are a series of figurative reliefs going down the column, and then their content is explained by a Latin inscription. For example, here on this very large relief, you can see the figure of Mary Magdalene. She's washing the feet of Jesus. You could probably work that out from the iconography of the piece itself, but actually, helpfully in this regard, the Latin inscription explains that.
As well as these Latin inscriptions, there is a more mysterious text carved in Anglo-Saxon runes.
The great thing about the Ruthwell cross is that it gives us a magnificent series of runic inscriptions.
The runes inscribed on the cross are letters from an ancient alphabet known as the Futhorc.
So we have runic letters which seem to be equivalent to Roman letters, such as the R, which stands for an R, but there are some false friends here as well. So, for example, you may be able to see something which looks like a dead ringer for an M. Unfortunately, that's the runic letter for E. Just to the left of that M, you can perhaps see a rune which looks like a little cross between a B and a P. And it's the runic letter known as thorn, and that stands for a th sound. Now, the Anglo-Saxons imported this into the Roman alphabet, and thorn itself has a most interesting history. It survives the Anglo-Saxon period, it survives into the 15th century, even later than that in some cases. And what happens to it is its shape changes and it becomes more and more shaped like a Y form. And that's why we get these ghastly things like ye olde tea shoppy. And the was never pronounced ye at all. Not at all. It's simply the manifestation of what the thorn, looked like in handwriting.
The runic inscriptions are difficult to read because, as with many ancient texts, there are no punctuation marks or spaces between words.
At the top, just above this beautiful vine scroll, you can see, very faded now, very abraded, an inscription which starts, Christ was on rhoda, Christ was on the cross. And then the inscription continues down the right-hand side, and when it reaches the bottom, there's another inscription which starts on the top left-hand side and goes down that way. You're only getting 2 to 4 runes per line. And if you can imagine a piece of modern writing divided up like that, with no word separation, it's very, very difficult indeed to read.
Whether fusai fiaron como, athilai til anum, each that I'll behelda. Sarah each was myth sorghum yudrivad, chanach each tham sejum tilhanda.
The runes on the cross spell out words similar to those of an Old English religious poem called The Dream of the Rood.
The Dream of the Rood is one of the outstanding examples of poetry in Old English. It really is head and shoulders above a lot of other pieces of religious literature. And it's a very, very interesting poem because unusually it recounts the crucifixion from the point of view of the cross. And this is an extraordinarily powerful poem. The poem itself survives in a much longer version, about 150 lines, in a manuscript dated to the late 10th century. What you see here are potentially runes dating perhaps from the 8th century. Some scholars think that they're original to the cross. Other scholars think instead that the runes were added perhaps as late as the 10th century.
To understand the Ruthwell cross in its original context, we have to put aside many modern assumptions about reading and writing in English.
The really interesting thing about literacies in Anglo-Saxon England is how much it differs from today. We consider the act of reading and the act of writing as being inseparable. This is certainly not the case in Anglo-Saxon England. We know, for example, that King Alfred learnt to read. His biographer makes a big fuss about this, but there's no evidence that he ever learnt to write. I would imagine that what you've got here is probably a wax tablet initially, with somebody with a design and saying, I would like it like this, and then the carver would do that. I'm not necessarily saying that the carver is illiterate. There's no evidence one way or the other. I'm simply saying that the technologies of reading and writing in the early medieval period are not the same as the technologies today.
Most of the manuscripts of Old English poems that still survive use the West Saxon dialect. However, many different language varieties fall under the umbrella of Old English, and the language variety in which the Ruthwell Cross poem was inscribed is in one such variety, Northumbrian.
The Northumbrian dialect is one of several dialects, attested dialects of Old English. We've got evidence for about 4 or 5 dialects of Old English, but one dialect is absolutely runs riot over the others, and that's the West Saxon dialect. And all the surviving poetry, almost all the surviving poetry, is copied into manuscripts which were copied in the West Saxon area, largely equivalent to southwest England today. But there are other big varieties of Old English. There's Mercian, which corresponds to the Midlands. There's Kentish. There's Northumbrian, which goes through the north of the country and into southern Scotland.
Because so little Northumbrian writing survived, the inscriptions on the Ruthwell Cross are particularly important.
All the literary texts that we have, for example, Beowulf, The Dream of the Rood and the Vercelli manuscript, seem to represent, by and large, that West Saxon dialect. Texts which would originally have been composed in other dialects became copied into the West Saxon dialect because of its political and cultural significance. The Ruthwell Cross is a monument to the Northumbrian dialect of Old English.